Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening to friends and colleagues joining from the evening time zones. Welcome. My name is Qinghai. I'm the director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University and also a faculty member at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, which is hosting today's event. This is part of our annual lecture series. This year, our annual lecture series has the theme of urbanization, well-being, and public policy, China in comparative perspectives. Today, I'm especially happy and honored to have Professor Clifton Emery to be the presenter today. I first got to know Professor Emery because he was a Korean expert serving on the dissertation committee of one of my students who studied North Korean refugees in South Korea. But today we are going to hear something different. His new research in China studying maltreatment through polyvictimization, a topic very dear and near to many social workers. Dr. Clifton Emery is the Associate Professor of Social Work and Social Administration at the University of Hong Kong. He's an academic, social worker, and a statistician. His research combines theoretical and empirical rigor and uses mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative research methodologies to investigate very important topics across settings. So today's presentation will be an illustration of that. So I'm very eager to hear his talk. Throughout the lecture, I invite the audience members to please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will turn to your questions at the end of the presentation. We're recording the lecture portion of today's event, but we are not recording the Q&A. So with that, I turn it over to you, Professor Emery. Welcome, and hopefully we will have a great discussion after your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gao. Much appreciated. I'm really honored to join you today. Thank you for all getting up in the morning, those of you who are in the East Coast time zone, and greetings from Hong Kong. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And I want to give some apologies in advance if this is a bit rough. I've had a very, very hectic semester, so I've been polishing this a bit, but it's not quite as polished as I would like it to be. So this talk is about polyvictimization, and particularly we're talking about child polyvictimization, which is what happens when children have multiple victimizations. And I'll just give you an overview of the talk in a moment, but this is a picture actually from Qinghai County where we did this research. And this study is done with my doctoral student, Sylvia Han, and my postdoc, Cherry Xie. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? All right, we'll talk about what polyvictimization is. And can you all see my screen okay and hear me okay? Okay, great. We'll talk about what we know about it already. Now, I should make a kind of explanation here. When I do research or do anything, I think that in theory, the way towards the biggest impact is to innovate and execute theory at the most rigorous level, innovate and execute methods at the most rigorous level, and try to answer the most kind of pressing substantive questions. I think that that's potentially or theoretically a good way to impact. It's a problematic way towards publication because nobody knows what you're doing if you innovate in every single domain. So it's a challenge, but I do think that this particular project has all three types of innovation. Okay, so the first claim that I'm making, a theoretical claim, is that we need to understand polyvictimization in terms of non-additivity. The second claim is that subjectivity matters in terms of the victim. And the third is that our current conceptual schemes are insufficient. Okay. Based on that, I developed a new typology of polyvictimization in terms of invasiveness, exploitativeness, and severity. And I'll explain this. This is just the roadmap. Okay. There was a preliminary oral history study, okay? And then we decided to study the Salar people in Qinghai. I will talk about the methods we used, okay? The results, discussion, conclusion, not a big surprise. Okay. So what are we talking about here? The idea of child polyvictimization was developed by Finkelhor in 2005. And it's basically any type of multiple victimization, okay? So what we're talking about are, when we talk about maltreatment, every child maltreatment expert talks about 4 things: neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse, sometimes called psychological abuse, okay? Those are really the 4 core, and they're repeated endlessly. You know, it's always what we study in a sense. And sometimes we add exposure to intimate partner violence, which is called IPV, okay? Or neighborhood violence. But most of the focus in this area is on child maltreatment, okay? And the way that this gets measured is we simply count up acts, right? So, okay, is there physical abuse? Is there neglect? And then when we talk about polyvictimization, we talk about having more than one type of these things, okay? As we know it, polyvictimization is associated with depression, suicidal ideation, PTSD, lower self-esteem, substance abuse, delinquency, mental health problems. And there are some citations for you for the record. In low and middle income countries, 38.1% of children are polyvictims. And the best data that we, oh, sorry, this is not 2013. The best data we have from China is that about 14% of Chinese people are polyvictims in their lifetime. That's Edward Chan's study from 2013, okay? And it's argued by Finkelhor and other experts that polyvictimization has lasting impacts on kids. But the thing is, there's also a ton of research on single victimization, and the findings are somewhat similar. So when I started studying this, my reaction was kind of, okay, so what's the rationale behind just adding up empirical types of victimization, you know, and then studying that? Is it just a new thing to study? Or, you know, is there something really substantive here? I'm unfortunately probably too suspicious of bandwagon effects for my own good. So after doing a review of this literature, I came to a conclusion that we have a problem with the way that we think about polyvictimization. There's a lot of research that suggests that compared to single victimization, more victimization is worse. I don't find this particularly surprising, and you probably don't either. But the studies frequently fail to distinguish the effects of polyvictimization from aggregated single victimization. So I think about it this way. You come up with a concept of polyvictimization in 2005, but we've been doing research on child victimization for, what, the last 50 years, roughly, which means there's also a ton of research out there on single victimization. Now, one way to study polyvictimization, if effects were additive, would just be to look at really well done single victimization studies and add up the coefficients, right, from the linear models that were used, or the logistic regression models, you know, basically combine the odds, the log odds coefficients to get the theoretical effects of multiple victimization. So if we could just add single victimization studies, we wouldn't quite need a study of polyvictimization, okay? We could just add up single victimization studies. So that makes it hard to justify a separate study of polyvictimization. So when you simply add up different levels of victimization, okay, you have 1, 2, or 3, or 4, and then you look at that, you're kind of denying the rationale for polyvictimization in the first place, which should be that not just that more victimization is worse, but that it's worse in a way that you couldn't understand by combining single victimizations. Okay. So if only, I'm going to reiterate a little bit, but should be clearer, I hope. If only cumulative effects are of interest, okay, we can just get the combined effect of physical abuse and sexual abuse from one study of physical abuse and another study of sexual abuse. And then we could get the combined effect by adding them. Okay. In the long run, then there's no particular need for separate studies of polyvictimization. Okay. The whole of victimization when you study it this way is potentially simply the sum of its parts. Okay. Now, the thing is, when the concept was developed, Finkelhor implied that effects should be non-additive. Because Finkelhor argued that adding a new type of victimization to a child's profile might have a larger impact than an increase in the frequency of single victimization. Okay. That argument is premised on the law of diminishing marginal effects, meaning at some point, adding one more act of physical abuse, if it's the same kind of physical abuse, the same amount of injury, may not have as much negative effect on the well-being of a child as if you added suddenly neglect or sexual abuse. It may have a disproportionately large effect to add a new kind of victimization after a certain point. That's, I mean, just like in economics, the law of diminishing marginal returns, it's the law of diminishing marginal effects, okay? But what we argue in both the theory paper and in this piece is that this is not so much what we should be worried about. What we should be worried about are combinations of victimizations that basically greatly increase risk for well-being. In this case, in this study, we're looking at suicidal ideation. But basically, what happens if you put two kinds of victimization together and risk just explodes, right? And we can capture that in our models, but we don't usually do that, okay? So we call this the multiplicative hypothesis, all right? What if instead of risk factors adding together, you know, just an additive model, what if when you put two risk factors together, you actually get a kind of exponential increase in risk, okay? You can study that by multiplying the two variables together and studying interaction effects. So we call this the multiplicative hypothesis, okay? And a recent article we published this year from Nepal did find some support for this hypothesis in that we found a positive interaction effect between sexual abuse and neglect in predicting adolescent depression symptoms in large, well, I think it was around 600 adolescents from Kathmandu, okay? This is important because the effects of neglect and sexual abuse together on depression couldn't be estimated accurately from the additive effects of each. Okay. And you can see, you know, this is that study. So when you have no sexual abuse, okay, you've got the relationship between neglect and depression. And then when you add sexual abuse is present, it suddenly gets, you know, it's much stronger, okay? There's a kind of logic to this, and that's shown on the lower left, if in the image on the lower left. So if you look at these these are three dimensions, and you can think of these as the three dimensions of my theory, which I'll explain in a moment. But you can see if you're just adding one dimension and you add, you know, let's say 1 on that dimension, you're going to get a linear increase in whatever it is you're measuring: depression, suicidal ideation, some kind of measure of anxiety, some measure of well-being. But when you add a new dimension, I don't know if you can see my cursor, suddenly you go from having 1 dimension to 2, and the effects potentially multiply, right? So you can see this, what you did have was a line, and now you have a plane. And the effects here, or the area of the plane, is the when you multiply the two sides together. And if you add yet another dimension, you no longer have a plane, you have a cuboid, okay? And if you wanted to understand or get the volume of the cuboid, you would again have to multiply. So this is how I'm kind of thinking about the logic of non-additivity. All right. I may be beating a bit of a dead horse here, but let me unpack an example of how this might mess us up. So there's a second piece of this, which is subjectivity. We are arguing that we should consider not just that effects may be multiplicative, but how we conceptualize maltreatment. What is it? Okay. We have this sense of a bruise is a bruise is a bruise. Why? Because we classify things in terms of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, always, right? So a bruise is a bruise is a bruise. If you have a bruise and it's caused by your parent and it's deliberate, this is physical abuse. But is this approach serving us? Okay. As Professor Gao mentioned, I do know quite a lot about Korea, which is why you've got a Korean named Chulsu here and Jimmy. But consider two relatively realistic hypotheticals, Jimmy and Chulsu, okay? Jimmy and Chulsu present with identical symptoms, okay? They both have 3 bruises across the back of the legs as a result of being hit with a stick by their fathers. Identical, right? So when we think about this, we think this is physical abuse, you know, probably similar etiology, probably similar consequences. That's the nature of how we conceptualize physical abuse or any kind of maltreatment. That's where we get. So it's identical physical abuse, okay? And yet, Jimmy was bruised. Okay, how did Jimmy get the bruises? He was bruised when he failed to bring home cigarettes for his father as requested, okay? So he got home, his dad's on the couch, drinking a beer, watching the game, you know, soccer or American football, depending on your preference, okay? And he says, Jimmy, did you get me my ciggies, right? And Jimmy says, no, Dad, you know, I'm 13, they won't sell them to me. And his dad is furious and gets up and chases him, okay? And grabs a stick and catches him 3 times across the legs before Jimmy gets out the door, all right? Chulsu, okay, got home. Dad was sitting on the couch drinking a beer, watching World Cup, okay? And Dad says, Chulsu, what did you get on your test today? And Chulsu says, I'm sorry, Dad, I got a C-, okay? And Dad says, you know what happens when you get a C-, stand against the wall, okay? And Chulsu does, and the dad takes a stick and hits him 3 times across the back of the legs, okay? And that's it. Now, those are both physical abuse. Those are both things we would and should intervene to deal with as social workers and as child protection workers. But the etiology is profoundly different. And the potential trauma is profoundly different. The consequences are profoundly different. Okay, this one, Jimmy's case, is uncontrolled. It doesn't feel controlled. It feels terrifying. Chulsu is also afraid, but this is less terrifying because Chulsu knows exactly what is going to happen. Okay, in the case of Jimmy, is this about Jimmy? Is the father thinking this is for Jimmy's own good? No, he's getting hit because Jimmy didn't do something that was inappropriate in the first place, which was buy cigarettes for his father. Okay, in the case of Chulsu, this was about, okay, maybe it's about the father's ego because my kid has to do well in school, but ostensibly it's because the father wants the kid to be successful in school. In other words, when Jimmy and Chulsu are looking back on their childhood, Chulsu may have a better chance of looking back and saying, okay, my dad was screwed up, but he cared about me. Okay. The implication is that our empirically driven types of victimization may obscure and distort its most important aspects. Okay. In order to cope with this situation, we need victim subjective voices to inform the development of new typologies. We need to focus not only on the things that we can see, and clearly identify, but things that we might not be able to see or measure immediately without trying to get inside the head of the people who experience this. Okay. In addition, if I don't have the right types of maltreatment, if I'm really, basically, if I'm doing physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse and neglect, but those aren't really coherent types, it's going to be hit or miss with the multiplicative hypothesis, because depending on the clustering of real types inside of what we've constructed, we may see it or we may not. In other words, measurement error is potentially an enormous problem if we're using the wrong categories. Okay. So, we already went through this. Types are usually referred to in terms of chronicity, severity, and the empirically derived neglect, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. Okay. Allow it all, take a thoughtful approach, but the substrata are always physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, like this. In other words, even when people try to construct types that are not based on this, they use these as the undergirding categories. Okay. These are all determined by observables and relatively uninformed by children's subjective experience. Okay. So what we're arguing here is that we have to first construct types that are not empirically reductionist. We have to be able to study things empirically, but we shouldn't have a bias towards only looking at the things that are easiest to measure. Okay. So we need to avoid that, pay attention to what children and adults who are victimized as children tell us, and then look for empirical regularities. Okay. If we take that kind of approach, two types that appear to be identical empirically, that is, Jimmy and Chosu, may actually belong to conceptually different types. Okay. And two types that appear to be different empirically, for example, a form of physical abuse and a form of sexual abuse, may be identical. I'll show you how we try to do this. Okay. So the problem we're arguing is that the theoretical foundation for polyvictimization is insufficiently developed. And in this forthcoming chapter, we argue that rather than theorize this in terms of the empiricals, we need to theorize it along three dimensions. One is how invasive the maltreatment is. The second is how exploitative it is. And the third has to do with severity. And you can see we've got a three-dimensional figure here, where the exploitativeness dimension ranges in extremes from well-meaningness to in virtual enslavement. Okay. The invasiveness ranges from in experience from extrinsic to almost colonization, like physical colonization of your body. And in terms of severity, you range from acts of omission, which is neglect, to acts of commission, which are acts of abuse. Okay, I'll unpack this a little bit. What do we mean by invasiveness? Okay. Medically, when access to the body is gained, an invasive procedure begins. Okay, and it ends when the instrument is removed. And that should give us thought, because it means that invasiveness isn't necessarily ill-intended. Okay. Our related definition is that normative boundaries around the body are transgressed, the body or the self, with invasiveness. Okay. This may be emotionally and physically uncomfortable, even if the intention is benign. For example, these are not benign examples. Okay. Force feeding is invasive. Okay. Munchausen's by proxy, where you basically factitiously create disorders for your child and then get medical procedures performed on them, is invasive. Okay. Sexual abuse, sex trafficking, sexual assault, we would argue are typically invasive. Okay. Organ trafficking is invasive. Okay. Exploitativeness involves instrumental use of a relationship with another person for the purposes of self-gratification, when there's a normative obligation to refrain. For example, emotional abuse conveying that children are only of value in meeting another's needs. Okay. Any form of trafficking, almost by definition. Okay. Sexual abuse, sexual assault are typically exploitative. Okay. Sadistic physical abuse can be exploitative if someone is gratifying their own desire to hurt somebody else. Okay. Severity is relatively well defined in the literature. At a minimum, it's a combination of chronicity, intensity, and probability of injury. And this dimension is centered around 0, with positive severity indicating abuse and negative severity indicating neglect. Okay. Fatalities are high at either end of that continuum. Okay. So that's the theory that the theoretical work that we kind of have done preliminarily. And that's where we're trying to innovate and push. I'm going to show you the preliminary qualitative oral history we did in brief to give you a sense of how we're thinking about testing this qualitatively. We are collecting qualitative data from Xinhua, but we're still analyzing it. So unfortunately, I can't present that part of it yet, but we do have the survey data in, and those findings are interesting. Okay. So our preliminary study interviewed an adult Chicana survivor of polyvictimization across 4 separate time slots. Each interview was about 3 hours long and produced more than 500 pages of transcribed text. Okay. What we do in the River of Life approach is it's very good for people who are suffering from trauma, okay? Because what it allows them to do is to draw their life as a river without using any words first. When someone has PTSD, the timeline can get very confused because as they relate their story, they may have flashbacks. And so it becomes difficult for the interviewer and the participant to stay on track. So the participant first draws their life as a river with no words and not using any words and not talking. Okay. So the participant was directed like this. I'm going to ask you to draw your life as a river. You can use any colors you want. Take your time. There's no right way or wrong way to draw it. The river can go up and down. It can become wide or narrow. It can wind or run straight. It can go underground, run into a lake or sea, or become a waterfall. Other rivers can merge with the river and flow together, or the river can divide, and other streams can split off from the river and go to different places. It may flow through forests, cities, or go over a waterfall, be clear or muddy, however you choose. I want you to draw, but I don't want you to write any words on the page. Okay. We also innovated with this approach to try to qualitatively test this theory. Okay. So after the river is produced, we identified, actually I identified with this particular interview, all of the most significant events that the participant shared with us, and then asked her about their dimensionality. So when you think about this event, like your mother abandoning you, would this be in one dimension like a squiggly line or a straight line? Would this be a 2-dimensional object like a triangle or a square, or would this be a 3-dimensional object like a cuboid or a sphere? And we got the participant to describe the size, the color, different colors, the shape of these experiences in her head. And then we got a graphics artist to create these objects in virtual 3-dimensional space, and sent them back to her and said, is this what, does this look like what you think it should? Okay. So these are subjectively created. For each victimization, we also asked her about how severe the victimization was, how invasive it was, and how exploitative it was on a scale of 1 to 10. Very, very basic, okay, indicator. But what that does is it allows us to compare the objects that she created to depict these experiences with what we would create based on her answers for severity, invasiveness, and exploitativeness, and see whether or not these tend to match. Okay. This participant was an adult survivor of chronic childhood sexual abuse, neglect, physical and emotional abuse. She describes her life as a circle, not a line. Okay. And this is her river with the circle on top. The nice thing about this is that it captures both victimization and resilience. Okay, so you can see her life begins at the source. Okay, and this is the river she drew. She said it's a circle. Okay, her mother abandoned her when she was about 3. The first sex abuse was by cousins when she was about 5. She was almost gang raped at 7. She was attacked by a girl gang at 8. Her parents engaged in a really terrible custody battle from 9 to 12. And from about 12 to 20, she was molested by her stepfather. Okay. And then this goes on from here. But I just want to point out some of the things you learn when you do a river of life history. See this green part of the river here? Can you see the bottom of the page with the river and this little line? Thank you. So when I was asking her, and she was doing this, and explaining this to me, she said, you know how sometimes there's a, what's it called, when a whole lot of algae, like a whole lot of plants start to grow in a river. Oh yeah, algae bloom, she said, right? And that's because there's not enough oxygen, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, that's this line here. That's where this starts, okay? Now, it should not surprise you that this is also where the molestation by her stepfather started on her history, okay? And what sort of boggled my mind is that algae bloom happens when a river is polluted. So she invoked the idea of pollution without ever saying the word, okay? But it's right there, okay? Right. We don't always catch the most devastating experiences with our 4 categories. So her mother was collaborating or basically turning a blind eye to the molestation and was also emotionally abusing her herself. So she had a choice at age, I think it was 12 or 13, whether to go or stay. Whether to go back to her father, who was not abusive, or at least not that abusive, or stay with her mother, who had the stepfather. And she, right before she went in to talk to the judge who was going to decide, she said, right before I went into that judge's room, my mom grabbed me. And she said, if you choose to be with your father, you will no longer be loved by God. You will no longer be accepted or belong to God, and you will no longer have God in your life. And religion was really, really important to this family. So she said, for her to say such a thing to me by the time I was 13 was basically like taking my own soul out of my body. That's how strongly manipulative it was. Okay, that is an experience you can see here. Okay, so what you're looking at are the images that she created, okay, on the left. The first one is abandonment by her mother, this ovoid. The first sexual abuse is this sort of zigzag figure, gang assault. And then this corkscrew figure is the sexual abuse by her custody ambush, what I just read you, okay? And this one is 8 years of sexual abuse by her stepfather, okay? This is what we get when we simply look at her 3 scores for severity, invasiveness, and exploitativeness. And you can see there are some figures where they seem to overlap, and there are some where, dimension-wise or kind of volume-wise, they seem to be a bit different. But there's some, convergence, which I would hope to see. Okay. All right. So that's what we have until now. And now let's talk about what we're doing in Qinghai. Okay. So why study the Salar people in the first place? Okay. The Salar are predominantly Muslim, Turkic ethnic minority, and they mainly live in Xunhua County and Qinghai. Okay. They most likely came there from Samarkand during the Tang Dynasty or the Yuan. Okay. They're famous for entrepreneurship and business. Okay. Marriages are usually arranged, and it's been less and less of late, but there's a cultural tradition of child marriage. This was out and out banned in 2020, but it was still happening up until then because the people performing the wedding ceremony wouldn't necessarily check the age of the girl involved. Okay. Now, the thing about child marriage, if you consider it for a moment, is that if the age gap is big enough, this will constitute a form of childhood sexual abuse. A 15-year-old cannot legally consent to have sex with a 22 or a 25-year-old. Okay, that's generally the standard in the child maltreatment literature. You cannot have too big of an age gap. Okay, that suggests polyvictimization rates may be high, and moreover, there's never been a study of child maltreatment victimization among the Salar. Okay. These are shots of Xunhua County that I mainly stole from the internet, but I think it's important to give you a sense of where we are. I spent a lot of time looking at Xunhua County via satellite imagery and telling my doctoral student where to get data. I'll explain how that worked momentarily. Okay. So the fact that it was just recently banned makes it kind of a matter of urgency to understand polyvictimization among the Salar, in particular, because as time passes, fewer and fewer women will be alive who've experienced child marriage, and it would be good to know about that before that happens. So, given the association between polyvictimization and suicide, we hypothesized the possibility of a multiplicative relationship between invasiveness, exploitativeness, and suicidal ideation. The analyses controlled for other risk factors, including age, depression symptoms, total score on the CTQ, and borderline personality disorder symptoms, which are also put people at high risk for suicide. Okay. We did PPS sampling of Xunhua County. There are 9 Xunhua County districts, which are called villages and towns. That is, do you know what PPS sampling is? Should I briefly explain that?
Probably. Just
okay.
Briefly. Thank you.
Right. So PPS is basically, depending on how big the population is in a place, it has a higher probability of being included in your sample. That avoids bias from oversampling sparse populations. Okay. The districts are called villages and towns, but actually they incorporate huge areas of unsettled land. I mean, they're just blank, like mountain. The overwhelming majority of the built environment was near the river, so a decision was made to oversample the areas near the river, okay? And in each district, 4 start points were randomly selected on the map using 2 random draws from the uniform distribution to get Cartesian coordinates. This is my map of Xunhua County, and it's probably too small, but you can see these little circles with crosses in them. Those are start points, okay? There are about 4 start points up here because these are 2 different districts, and they're not on that, they're on a blown up version. But basically, you can see also all my measurements. I'm doing uniform draws from the uniform distribution that locate the start point. Now, as you might imagine, I don't want to send my interviewers to like a mountaintop where there's nobody. So that's where the satellite imagery comes in. I have to find the habitations or the village or the cluster of houses that are closest to the start point. So you kind of circle out until you find what you're looking for. Okay, and it shouldn't just be one house. I took pity on my research assistants. Okay. 2 out of every 4 start points were drawn from areas adjacent to the river for the reasons I gave, and the 10 married women living closest to each random start point were recruited into the study. This meant 40 women were interviewed in each of the 5 districts for a total of 200 married Salar women. Nobody refused. I mean, this doesn't happen, right? But nobody refused. Student was able to get really helpful local authorities who helped helped to introduce and helped to collect the data. So that was great. Everybody who collected data went through 2 days of training on informed consent. They had to pass a written exam and a certification interview. I always do that because we're studying really sensitive subjects, and you should know that you should know how to actively protect the confidentiality of the survey and the interview when you're doing it. Otherwise, you can really put some of the participants at risk. Okay, and we got IRB approval from Hong Kong University. Okay. We measured suicidal ideation the past 2 weeks. I thought about suicide and I made plans to commit suicide, not at all or less than 1 day, 1 to 2 days in the past week, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 7 days, or nearly every day for 2 weeks. Okay. Invasiveness, we measured with, I'm just checking the time here. Sometimes during a bad experience, it can feel like an invasion of your privacy, your body, or yourself. You might feel like the experience has gotten under your skin, or even like your body has been taken over by somebody else. We can call this kind of experience invasive. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is the least and 10 is the most invasive, how invasive was the experience you described above? And what we had them describe was basically pick out the worst thing that they could remember from their childhood and talk about that. Sometimes during or after a bad experience, you can feel used. This might happen when someone else is getting something from you without worrying about you at all. For example, someone might do things that hurt you just to benefit him or herself. Or maybe they don't treat you the way they should because they want something for themselves. When it feels like someone is using you, we can say this feels exploitative. Thinking back on the experience you described, please describe how exploitative it was, where 1 is the least and 10 is the most. Okay. We also measured the CESD, depression, child maltreatment victimization via the CTQ, and borderline personality symptoms via the 10-item McLean screening instrument. Okay, what do we find? 7% of married Salar women had thought about or planned suicide in the past 2 weeks. The mean age was 34 with a range of 18 to 61. 1 in 3 had been married before age 18. Nearly 20%, so 1 in 5, reported being neglected as children. 17.4% reported being physically abused. And I should clarify, these are really conservative measures, okay? Because the CTQ asked, did this never happen, rarely, sometimes, frequently, or very often? And I used the cutoff at sometimes, which means there were people who said this happened rarely that aren't included in the group, okay, in the victimized category. Okay. 6.5% reported some form of sexual abuse in childhood. 1 in 3 had at least one of these victimizations, and almost 10% were polyvictims. Mean invasiveness was about 3, and mean exploitativeness was about 3.4. Okay, what are these things? How do these things relate to each other? Invasiveness of the worst experience was positively associated with suicidal ideation. Okay. Exploitativeness was also positively associated with suicidal ideation. And I think it's important to note that both of these associations held when we controlled for depression symptoms. So it's normal in social work to think depression, suicide, depression, suicide, depression, suicide. But the thing is, depression only explains about, I think it's about 40% of suicide attempts, which means other stuff is going on. And it looks like some of the things that are going on are invasiveness and exploitativeness of maltreatment experiences. Okay. Exploitativeness was marginally associated with childhood victimization. We have, unfortunately, a very small sample tonight. Invasiveness was not. Okay. Depression symptoms were positively associated with suicidal ideation. So, quick quiz. Given we have clustered data, what kind of linear model should we be doing? Are you out there? Want to answer?
You're teaching a class, right?
Sorry,
Yeah.
it's a habit.
to one student of me, yeah. I do
Okay,
think the
sorry.
participants are typing their responses. Yeah,
Right, I
please
know
go
you know
ahead.
the answer.
Right.
I know you know the answer. So, okay, so basically, we should be doing some kind of multi-level modeling because we have clustering. We could also do clustered standard errors, but we shouldn't just be running OLS regression because we're going to get biased inferences that way. Okay, so here are our multi-level main effects and interaction model. And you can see not a lot is going on in the main effects model. There's like a marginal effect of age. But once we've got everything controlled for, a lot of stuff gets wiped out. But when we, oh, I'm sorry, actually this borderline personality symptoms is significant in both models. I just forgot to add the stars in the first one. But when we add in the interaction between exploitativeness and invasiveness, we get a significant interaction effect in predicting suicidal ideation here. Okay. All right. So how to think about this? The thing to pay attention to is this is negative here in this model. It's positive in this model, exploitativeness, and this is positive in this model, but this is negative and negative. So how do you think about these things? The way that I tend to think about these things is these are linear and these are, this is a multiplicative effect. So these act as a kind of correction that shows you where the kind of rise begins. Rather than thinking, oh, it's a negative relationship, you've got a strong positive one here and it's multiplicative. So I'm going to show you a very non-standard interaction chart, okay? Instead of showing you the typical interaction chart, what I'm going to show you is where does the exponential relationship begin, okay? So this is what happens as both invasiveness and exploitativeness increase in tandem. In other words, they go up together one by one. So in the first point, this is suicidal ideation is predicted by the model when both invasiveness and exploitativeness are 1. Okay. In this one, it's when they're both 2. Here, when they're both 4. Here, when they're both 6. Here, when they're both 8 and 10. Okay. And what this allows us to see is, okay, for low levels of invasiveness and exploitativeness, there's not much going on. And in fact, the model is saying, suicidal ideation goes down. Okay. But then somewhere around 7, it starts, when both are about 7, it starts to increase exponentially. And that's what I care about in a sense as a social worker, because it's at this point that levels of maltreatment and polyvictimization are getting so high that they're really putting women at high risk and would have put them at risk as children as well. Okay. So what do we find? The evidence in support of the theory is mixed and it's extremely preliminary, okay? But it's promising, okay? Holding the classic polyvictimization measure constant, there appears to be a multiplicative effect between invasiveness and exploitativeness in terms of the worst experience in predicting suicidal ideation. Okay. Just to say, and it's important to mention that this is when depression symptoms are controlled. Okay, so even controlling for depression symptoms, we're seeing this. And other risk factors for suicidal ideation. Okay. BPD symptoms are also highly predictive of suicidal ideation, controlling for depression and invasiveness and exploitativeness of maltreatment. Okay. The study shows that these multiple types of victimization are common among Salar women, and suicidal ideation is not uncommon. We do need policies to be developed to identify marginalized women who are at the greatest risk for suicide. And this is particularly important during the ongoing pandemic and pandemic policy in China, as rural ethnic minority women may be more isolated than usual. Okay. Maltreatment and polyvictimization were also common experiences. Further policy development is needed, in particular, central and local authorities. There's mainland China, in my view and in my experience, having lived in Beijing for 2 years, especially in rural areas, there is a scarcity of formal resources. It means that, you know, if there's a homicide in a very rural area, it takes a police officer 2 days to get there. So it's going to be really difficult to do formal child protection consistently in an area like this, which means that the state may need to work with civil organizations and communities in order to deal with maltreatment and polyvictimization informally, as well as formally. That would also allow effective triaging. The preliminary measure shows a multiplicative effect of invasiveness and exploitativeness, even when we control for polyvictimization and depression. Hence, the subjective experience of maltreatment may be important in understanding suicidal ideation among polyvictims, even when you control for the maltreatment experience. What do we need? A lot more research, a lot more measure development, because these measures are really, really basic, and conceptual work at the theoretical level to further test the potential contributions of this development. Okay. Sample size is random. I insist on that. I have a master's degree in statistics. I do not like non-random samples, but it's really quite small. And statistical power is almost certainly lacking in some of the estimates. Okay. The findings are generalizable to rural, but not urban married Salar women. There are a fair number of Salar people living in Xining, which is not in Xinhua County, okay, but it's in Qinghai. Like I said, we need more measure development, and the measure of suicidal ideation also requires further development. It's also pretty basic. Okay, the study is cross-sectional. It's based on self-report. Okay, the findings are very preliminary. The victimization estimates are almost certainly under reports because this is a conservative culture. People don't necessarily like to talk about this. Okay. Salar women, sorry, I can't see my own screen, are because it's blocked by this by the Zoom. Okay. Their suicidal ideation is related to their subjective experience of victimization. Okay, and we need future research with large samples that include emotional abuse and current intimate partner violence victimization. Okay. A measure of severity requires proper development, and although the total CTQ score is a beginning, I find it still problematic. We also need to study adolescent Salar so we can better understand this phenomenon, you know, immediately. Okay. And at a broader level, policymakers should consider new criteria for understanding the mental health risks from violence. That is to say, if the subjective experience really matters, as it seems to, we're doing children a disservice by focusing only on the traditional measures and concepts that we use. Okay, we've got a lot of work to do. It's basically what this boils down to. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and like I said, I'm honored to present to you guys today. So thank you so much for your time and the opportunity.
Thank you so much. This is so, fascinating. And the issue you investigate, just so concerning. And I totally agree with you. So much research is needed, both conceptually, empirically, quantitative, qualitative. And these marginalized groups, who would go and study them and listen to them? And also the interview technique you used, right? The life river.
Yeah, river of life.
River of life oral history method. It's so powerful. So I just want to applaud you for doing this important work. And the images you showed, I come from a mountainous area, so I totally can relate. Even to imagine to carry out research in those areas. And it's difficult, but it really touches upon these very remote, neglected places and people's lived experiences there. So very, very powerful. I have a bunch of questions, but I think maybe let's go to the first question in the Q&A box. And I invite our